Well, Merry Christmas once again. Christmas is an interesting season. I've lived in different parts of the world, and Christmas always looks different depending on which country that you're in. Do you ever wonder why it is the things that we do? Why do we do it? How has Christmas evolved and changed to the point of how we're celebrating it today here in the 21st century? There's a lot of tradition that we have that goes back centuries, and yet there's a lot of things that we do that's really quite modern as well. Within the Western world, Christmas has changed dramatically just within the last 100 years. 100 years seems like a long time if you're really young. If you're getting older, 100 years goes by really, really quickly. Did you know that the idea of Santa that we have today, the modern day concept, really developed just within the last 100 years? It was back in 1931 that Coca-Cola asked a painter to paint a picture of Santa for their advertising, and that picture transformed how people within North America view Santa today. It was Coca-Cola. And that's what created the pictures. It's really quite fascinating in terms of how that changed. And the painter, in terms of the things that brought up how he came up with the idea of Santa, is that he was reading the poem, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," which was written in 1822. And he read that poem, and that's where he came up with the idea of the modern day Santa that we have today. But did you know the idea of the modern day Santa came from an original idea of a real person who lived? His name was St. Nicholas. He was a leader in a church. He was a bishop in the 3rd century, so that's over 1,500 years ago. He lived in a place, modern-day Turkey, and he was a fairly wealthy person. We don't know a lot about him, but he used his wealth to do good things. He helped free enslaved people. He used his money to feed the poor and do many other good things. But the idea of Saint Nick from 1,500 years ago looks very, very different from our Santa today. That story has changed. Christmas, the meaning of Christmas. Have you ever thought about what that means? It comes from the word Christ's Mass. The idea of Christ, it means anointed one. And it's a Christian idea of God coming down to earth in the form of a human being, the Christ. Mass is this idea of a liturgical service. And so people would gather on that day to celebrate the birth of Jesus. Looks really, really different today. When we talk about that story of Jesus' birth, Christmas is so much more than just a story of Saint Nick coming and delivering presents, but originally it was this idea of God coming to earth in the form of a child. If you thought about that story before, we read about it today. It was read by several different people from a couple different biographies of Jesus. There might be questions that pop in your mind when you hear that story. There are people that I've told that story to before that had a hard time believing it in reality. Maybe the question could be, did Jesus even exist? Or is Jesus just a made-up fairy tale? I know people have that question today. Is this Jesus that we talk about at Christmas, was he even a real person? Several years ago, there was an author. His name was Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is a New Testament scholar. He knows a lot about the Bible, but he's actually not a Christian. He's an atheist. So he knows a lot about the Bible, but he's not a Christian at all. And Bart Ehrman says that historians across the globe will say that without a doubt, Jesus exists. Bart Ehrman believes that Jesus exists. He doesn't believe a lot of many things that we believe about Jesus. But in his book called Did Jesus Exist?, he wrote this. He says, the reality is that whatever else you may think about Jesus, he certainly did exist. This view is held by virtually every expert on the planet. This is coming from a guy who's made a fortune off of writing books against Christianity. But even he acknowledges the existence of Jesus. Bart Ehrman says the best evidence in the biographies, or the best evidence are in the 4 biographies that are in our Bible today. They're biographies written by eyewitnesses of Jesus. And all those 4 biographies, they're called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written between 20 to 40 years after the life of Jesus. So they were eyewitness. They were written within a very, very short period of time. And then there's other historians out there. There was a guy named Josephus. He was a Jewish historian. There was a guy named Tacitus. He was a Greek historian who wrote a little bit about the life of Jesus. So these are sources that are outside the Bible. So we can probably safely say this fellow Jesus wasn't a fairy tale. He actually did exist. But I think there's a deeper question that I think a lot of people have. And I think it's a very legitimate question. And it's this: weren't these stories changed over time? Maybe you've asked yourself that yourself. Okay, so we have these stories in the Bible. Jesus did exist, but weren't they changed? Kind of like the story of St. Nick. The St. Nick from 3rd century is very different from Santa Claus today, and hasn't that been changed? The idea has been maybe there was mythology that was mixed in and the story of Jesus distorted. And I think that's a legitimate question. The problem is when we look at the story of Jesus' birth and the story of Jesus is that it was written in too short of a period of time for it to be mythologized. What I mean by that is myth develops over long periods of time, told over hundreds, if not thousands of years. But these stories that are written in our Bible, as I said earlier, were written between 20 to 40 years after the life of Jesus. It's just too short of a period of time for them to be turned into myth, written within a generation. The interesting thing as well is that the followers of Jesus, they were called disciples. And disciples, their main job was to follow their teacher around and to memorize and to take to memory everything that their teacher taught. 2,000 years ago, that's what a disciple did of a rabbi. And so they would listen to everything that Jesus said and taught, and many of the things that Jesus taught, he taught over again and over again and over again. And his disciples, their job was to sit and listen, to take it all in, and to memorize it. And so one of the questions about Christmas is, isn't it kind of like the game of telephone? You ever played telephone before with your friends? You say one thing, and you whisper something into somebody's ear, and then they got to whisper it to another person. They whisper it to another person. By the time it gets to the end, whatever was whispered has been completely changed. And so the question has been, isn't it kind of like that? It's kind of been distorted over time. The problem with that is that the people who wrote the biographies of Jesus, they weren't many, many years after the fact, but they were the people who actually witnessed it. So they're writing down their memories. They're writing down what they experienced. So it couldn't be like that game of telephone. It's been asked, why is it the disciples took so long to write the biographies? Why 20 years? Why 30 years? Why 40 years after the fact? Why would they wait so long to write it down? Well, the reason why that is because in ancient times, things were typically transmitted orally. They told stories. That's how Jesus did things. That's how he communicated. And so within the first several decades after Jesus' life, the disciples went around telling things orally, telling stories, and that's how they communicated. But then eventually the disciples actually started to die off. And it's at this point that they realized we need to record this. We need to write this down, and so it won't be lost. There's a fellow named Alexander the Great that many of us know about. And Alexander the Great his biographies were written 400 years after his life. And typically, historians believe that what we read about the life of Alexander is fairly correct. It's interesting how we can believe the stories of Alexander the Great were written 400 years after. It puts light on the story of Jesus, that what we have read in the Bible can be trusted. One last question that maybe you have had if you hear the story of Jesus, and especially if you've heard it for the very first time, is how can I believe in all of the spectacular miracles, like the virgin birth, like angels, like miraculous stars that people are following? Well, I would encourage you that if there is a God out there who created the heavens and the earth, created this world that we live in, created you and me, that it's not too far-fetched that this God who created everything could also place a baby into the womb of a young virgin lady. It's not too big of a stretch to believe that God could come down in the flesh as a human being. And it's not too stretched to believe that there was a star that Magi followed to come and find this baby. But these aren't the most miraculous things that Christians believe in. The foundation of the whole Christian story and belief is that Jesus died and he rose from the grave within his own power. The first eyewitnesses believed this and they died for it. Christians didn't make this up. It is actually what caused them to believe in the first place. So Luke and Matthew, there's 4 biographies, but there's 2 that talk about the birth of Jesus, and that's Matthew and Luke. Luke says this at the beginning of his biography, says this: many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They use the eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write an accurate account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught. Luke investigated all these things from eyewitnesses. He wrote it not just so that they could have a holiday one day and give each other gifts, but he wrote it so that they could believe. This is a belief that doesn't just change a holiday, but this is a belief that changes lives. In the book of Matthew, we read of these 3 magi, or wise men. They were actually scholars, most likely from Persia. They loved astronomy. They studied the stars. And as they were studying the stars, what they saw was a star that to them represented that a king was going to be born in Israel. They came bearing really expensive gifts. They came bearing gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We're aware of gold. Frankincense and myrrh in the ancient world was also incredibly expensive. We today, in the 21st century, we still have an opportunity to bring gifts to Jesus. You may be asking, what kind of gift am I going to bring to Jesus? I'm not sure Jesus needs your gold or your money or a Starbucks gift card or anything like that. But the gift that you can bring to Jesus is your very life. Jesus wants to have a relationship with you. That baby that was born 2,000 years ago, he died and he rose again and he ascended to heaven and he still lives. He wants to know you. And that's the greatest gift. He's not asking for anything other than that, is a relationship with you. And when you choose to follow him, when you choose to come into a relationship with him, you choose to learn from him, to become his disciple. The scriptures teach us that when we begin to have a relationship with God, that when we invite him into our lives, that the light of the world comes into our lives. I just took a candle and lit it with the Christ candle. Jesus was the original light of the world. His light was so bright, he said he came to push out the darkness. But it's so much greater than that. You know, when each one of us chooses to know Jesus, chooses to have a relationship with Jesus, that same light comes and lives in us.